for instance, if I may. Pretty well everybody has their seat now. I'm Wayne Marston. I'm official opposition critic for human rights, and I just want to welcome you here today. We've had the pleasure of being your hosts and arrange this. It's very significant for people to hear the real stories, because oftentimes the stories that are coming out of different countries match the reality on the ground. So we have people here and provide that kind of information. I'm going to turn it back over to Chris because we're running a little bit late. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wayne. And if I could just take a moment to introduce the panel, and maybe I'll start with Wayne, who's our host. Wayne Marsden is the Member of Parliament for Hamilton East, Stony Creek. I practice law and have been so with the Viet 10 for about 10 years now. Wayne Marsden has always been a good friend and a trusted office that those who work on human rights issues can count on. So I'd like to thank Wayne now for that. Again, thank you, Wayne.
Thank you.
I'll begin with Chairman of the 10, Diem Do, who is in Canada today and has been debriefing members of Parliament on the Hill and taking time this evening to give a more fuller story of the prospects for democracy in Vietnam. We also have with us Professor Vu, who has done some fascinating work, important work on Canada-Vietnam relations in Canada. So we'll have him speaking tonight as well. And I'll maybe just start with a few thoughts from my experiences over the past 10 years monitoring human rights and, unfortunately, human rights abuses in Vietnam. The Communist Party has been particularly heavy-handed on citizens in Vietnam. And as I think you'll hear tonight, process regime change may be growing. The victims of that moment are the people of Vietnam, as there's more and more crackdowns. The report for 2013 that was issued on human rights abuse in Vietnam was dramatic and, quite frankly, draconian in the techniques and the abuse that was occurring. I'm going to highlight just 3 or 4 of the decrees and the articles of the penal code, which just on their face are undemocratic and the antithesis of a country moving towards democracy. But I think it's important to know about them as we speak to the international community in hopes that the international community can exercise what moral suasion it has and what real tools it has in its toolkit to help move change forward. Decree 7 by the communist government actually bans bloggers from discussing news on the internet.
Can I break in just for a second? I just want to let people know, if anybody needs French translation, we have translation at the back, and we have the devices. Sorry for that. I should have done that in the beginning.
Yeah, my apologies. I was actually told to mention that. So please, if anyone needs French translation, Tom or others have it. Decree 72 actually bans bloggers from discussing the news. In the essence of blogging, it's become almost the new arm of the media. The incidence of bloggers jailed, tortured arbitrarily, and with precision by the government are pretty dramatic. We have a report, and I've got both the Human Rights Watch report on police brutality issue of September 14th, for September 2014, as well as a human rights annual review that was done for 2013 with more instances, which I think it's always important to look at the individual cases where human rights have been violated to remind us of the bigger picture, which our guest of tonight. There's also Decree 92, which the Vietnamese communist government put forward, restricting religious freedom. And the crackdown on religious bodies and organizations in Vietnam has been dramatic. Whether Buddhist or Catholic, the Catholic Church and Catholics practicing, as well as Protestants, have faced the wrath of the regime, primarily because this new Decree 92 says you need to have had no violation of law for 20 years, but to assemble is a violation. So it becomes very difficult to justify Christian churches, for instance, have been victims and targeted. So that's another decree that the government's been using. Articles of the, I'll only mention two. Article 258, breach of which can give you 3 to 6 years sentence in jail, is for abuse of democratic rights. Hard to imagine use democratic rights. The Article 79 of the Penal Code, subversion of the state, 3 years sentence to death sentence. Article 88 of the Penal Code is criticizing the state. Well, you can't have democracy without human rights. And there is a real and pressing issue in Vietnam right now with human rights. So I wanted to share some of the laws that are on their face that create huge challenges for the democratic process. But I think there is still a lot of hope horizon. And I'll turn now to our guest of honor, Chairman Viet Thanh Diem Do.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that introduction and that opening. And Mr. Wayne Marston, Professor Vu, ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to echo Chris again to thank Mr. Marston for his important. And not only that, he has been supporting the cause of human rights. He has been championing the rights of the many dissidents who are in jail. So thank you again for your support. The Vietnam War in 1975, Canada accepted many Vietnamese refugees and provided a new home for these refugees. And for that kindness and generosity, I would like to take this opportunity and really thank you for providing new home to the many Vietnamese refugees who came over here, not just right after 75, but throughout the 80s and the 90s as well. But hey, nearly 40 years later, after the end of the war, many people may still wonder, why does it even matter for a place like Vietnam to have human rights and democracy? And I want to take a few minutes to address that first before discussing what may happen in Vietnam in the near future. With 90 million people, Vietnam is a mid-sized country with abundant natural resources and huge economic potential. More than half of the population was born after 1975 and has a very high literacy rate. So Vietnam indeed is a very choice for foreign investment. Now, on top of that, Vietnam occupies a strategic geopolitical location, a 200-kilometer coastline adjacent to the hotly contested East Sea, or commonly known as South China Sea as well. This area has one of the world's busiest sea lanes, critically important for international trade, with 75% of the traffic passing through Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. So, and furthermore, Vietnam right now does have a fairly modernized and well-trained military. So this military can possibly play a pivotal role in enhancing regional security. So if you take all of that into consideration, transitioning Vietnam to a democratic society is very crucial, because being a free democratic society, Vietnam is in a better position to social and economic development, to become a better trading partner, and also provide Vietnam with more opportunity to galvanize domestic support for policy to security, stability. So in short, a free, stable, democratic Vietnam can play a powerful role in stabilizing Southeast Asia and also help to anchor a more prosperous ASEAN. But the reality is Vietnam is one of the last 5 remaining communist authoritarian regimes in the world right now. And needless to say, human rights in Vietnam has been terrible over the last 60 years since the Communist Party seized control of North Vietnam in 1954. Actually got worse after they took over South Vietnam in 1975. However, things are beginning to change in Vietnam recently, especially since 2006. The pace of change started to pick up considerably in Vietnam. And over the last 8 years, the government's control over the Vietnamese society is erode. And right now, more forces are openly challenging the one-party rule. I want to spend the next 5 minutes to quickly summarize the key challenges that the Vietnamese government is facing right now. The first challenge is that there is a bitter infighting and intense power struggle within the leadership between 2 camps. On the one side, we have Prime Minister Nguyễn Tân Dũng. On the side, we got an alliance between President Trương Tấn Sang and the Communist Party chief Nguyễn Phú Trọng. Now, this particular infighting or power struggle is very severe, and it's no longer a secret from the public. And it has a paralyzing effect on their leadership, damage their chain of command, and a compounding effect on the population, causing further resentment from the population and their own party rank and file. Now, in 2016, they're going to have the 12th Communist Party Congress. And I can bet you that the power struggle will only get more intense between now and 2016, which will further impact party unity and authority. The second problem they're facing right now is the government or the regime is widely viewed by both the people and their own party membership as being weak and unwilling to China's aggression in the South China Sea. On top of that, they have, because of their close connection to Beijing and their constant efforts to defend their relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, all of these activities or behavior from them paint them as traitors in the eyes of the people. The third problem is that because of the infighting, the dilemma, because of the extremely corrupt nature of leadership, many former high-ranking communist officials, party intellectuals, party members have actually switched sides and joined the pro-democracy movement, demanding more freedom, more and human rights. And right now, morale within the party has deteriorated sharply. The number of Communist Party members who quietly left party or they just stopped participating had reached a record high, prompting the leadership to acknowledge the problem and scrambling for a solution. The fourth problem they're facing is that since 2007, even though there has been a massive crackdown on the pro-democracy movement, have proven its ability to withstand the persecution and continue to grow. And the internet in particular has been powerful. Close to 40 million people having access to the internet in Vietnam and about 20 million Facebook accounts. The internet really had allowed people and activists alike to circumvent the offline absence of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and of association. And the fifth and the last problem is the economy. The Vietnamese economy is actually still struggling big time. This is a direct result of years of mismanagement and corruption. Just on a couple of days away, flying over here from California, I was reading the World Bank report on Vietnam. And the World Bank ranked Vietnam's competitiveness as being second worst in Southeast Asia, doing better only better than country. That's how bad the economy is in Vietnam right now. And the level of public debt had reached a record high of about 8% of the GDP. So Vietnam's economy is a sick economy. It's not doing very well right now. And the problem is the financial sector has been the main problem that's dragging down the economy. But that particular sector is extremely corrupt with bad debts and bad practices. And on top of that, leadership is unwilling, absolutely unwilling to take the necessary corrective measures because that will impact directly the pockets and the interests of the special power groups behind them. So those are the key challenges that the Vietnam government is facing right now. And personally, I seriously doubt that they have the ability to resolve all of these challenges within the next few years. So for the first time in a very long time, we are presented with some real opportunity to push forward for meaningful political change and human rights change in Vietnam. For us, for people who operate inside Vietnam and for democracy activists like me, we have to push on. We have to push forward with our nonviolent campaign to mobilize and create more pressure in Vietnam for real change. But to the international community, to the Canadian government, we ask for your help in 4 particular key action items. The first one is to call for the immediate and unconditional release of political dissidents, democracy, social activists who are currently held in prison. Second action item is to reach out to civil society groups, to grassroots organizations who are being organized inside Vietnam right now, especially those who are advocating for legal reform, for human rights, for democracy. On top of that, by reaching out and getting into contact and supporting human rights defenders inside Vietnam is also very critical. The third action item is to put the focus on legal reform in Vietnam. A while ago, Chris mentioned that the Vietnamese government, I like to use the term, there's no rule of law in Vietnam, but rule by law. The legal system is being used as a tool to keep everybody in line inside Vietnam. So the international community need to exert pressure so that the Vietnamese government will do away with draconian statutes such as Article 79, Article 88, or Article 58 of the Penal Code. And the fourth and last action item is to integrate human rights improvement or requirement as part of the bilateral exchange, whether it's trade, education, or diplomacy. So to sum everything, I want to take one last minute to share with you my own personal experience. I have joined this fight for democracy and human rights in Vietnam when I was a university student more than 30 years ago. And during that long time, I have seen so many sacrifices made by so many people. And at times, it was tough. At times, it felt like we were in a dark tunnel with no way out, no end in sight, no light at the end of the tunnel. Today, first time in 30 years, I would like to share with you my belief that I have seen the light at the end of the tunnel. I have seen the way out. And I think for the first time in 30 years, I firmly believe that we have a real chance to bring positive change to Vietnam. I believe no tyranny or warfare. But make no mistake, the road to that light at the end of the tunnel is still full of challenges and obstacles. For many years, the international community, the Canadian government, the Canadian people have been supporting human rights in Vietnam. And for that, we thank forward. We continue to push forward for change in Vietnam. And as we do that, we still need support from the international community to bring about a swift change to Vietnam. And I firmly believe that once we have a stable, democratic Vietnam, then Vietnam can be a strong, positive partner for a safe and prosperous Southeast Asia and the Asia region and beyond. Thank you very much.
Just before we go to our next important guest, I'd like to make a comment. I'd like to tell you a story that may be of very significant importance. Over the last 10 years, Canada on the world stage has been damaged. And our support for human rights from the government that we have today has been problematic in our view. They've 30-some free trade agreements with other countries where include human rights as a core value within those agreements. We had visitors to Canada recently from, I believe it was Guatemala, it may have been Colombia, and I took them to meet our leader, Thomas Mulcair. And without any prompting from myself or anyone else, when Mr. Mulcair was listening to their story, and this was horrific, it was about a Canadian who, their operation in that country had ended up with people being murdered, and a little terrible story. Mr. Mulcair said that an ND government, one of the lenses it would always look through when it made decisions was human rights. And the second thing he said to her that was very important, in my view, was that the agreements that the United Nations, Canada's signatories to, would be something we would enforce. We understand that the current government has actually hired legal to try out of some of those agreements with the United Nations. Now, I won't be too political here. I can tell you that I truly believe the NDP will be the next government in Canada. We're working hard to do that. And so I wanted to have that little slice of that picture, because supporting what is happening in Vietnam is very important. Your remarks about the key position Vietnam holds in that part of the world and for a significant break in democracy. And I was to Burma, Myanmar,
Yes.
and I saw what was happening there in the sense of multinational companies coming in to try to get involved with the extraction of minerals there. And the resources of Vietnam are going to be tempting to people too. And that's a lever that can be used, as you've indicated, with them to ensure they move towards a better human rights record and ultimately democracy.
Professor Vu, I turn the mic over to you.
So thank you very much. Distinguished member of Parliament, guests and friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to everyone. Chers distingués et amis, je crois que mon français est beaucoup mieux, mais je préparais un discours en anglais aujourd'hui et je vais essentiellement toucher les questions sur le rapport que j'ai fait au gouvernement du Canada au mois de mars de cette année. This is a very outstanding moment for me to be with so many people tonight in such a remarkable place. And as Mr. Marston just said that we hope the NDP will be the next government of Canada.
We're working on it.
And congratulations on that. So I would like to thank you for you to organize this remarkable evening. And I'm very touched with the analysis of Mr. Dindo. I think this is a very accurate and an excellent analysis of Vietnam today. This really new picture of so thank you very much for your presentation. And as you said, that given the increasing importance of Asia Pacific in politics and trade, it is very important for Canada to be prepared for the 21st century. Mr. Dindo mentioned the geopolitics of Vietnam and the South China Sea. I'm sorry to use that term, the South China Sea, because I'm a scholar, but I would use the word Biển Đông, like Vietnam, the East Sea of Vietnam. However, that area is shared by many countries, so the issue is not resolved at all. So I prefer the term that internationally refer common. And Vietnam, why not often discussed as China? Vietnam is still an important player in Southeast Asia, with its 19 million people. And bilateral relation between Hanoi and Ottawa, although is relatively young for 40 years, but remained productive for the last 10 years. However, despite steady relations with Vietnam, Hanoi continued to defy international concern, to say nothing of raising by our Canadian government over its deplorable human rights record. So political and civil rights are equally suppressed. Call for government of Vietnam to reform have fallen in deaf ear as they continue to crack down on activists and dissidents. However, I have a few letters from our Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Canada continued to say that every time Canada had the opportunity to discuss with its counterpart, Canada always raised the issue right. So that I have the confirmation from the office of the Prime Minister and Mr. Bear. Let me just put here the letter from the government, the Prime Minister office, and Mr. Bear. In Mr. Bear, he mentioned that the promotion and protection of human rights is an integral part of Canada's foreign policy. Canada stand up for human rights and take principal position on important issues to promote freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So we have very clear position from Canada. But Hanoi to grant the fundamental human rights has largely served as an obstacle to improve the relation between Canada and Vietnam. I believe it's Canada to be proactive and to make sure that Hanoi understands that Canadian foreign policy must address democracy, rule of law, human rights, and opportunity with Canadian value. However, by smartly investing in long-term initiative in Vietnam, Canada can establish a foundation so that future generations can enact those changes so desired. In my report in last 2014, I suggest two recommendations. First, I would suggest creating a joint Canada-Vietnam advisory comprised of each country civil society. And that is, I joined the comment of Mr. He said that we have to get engaged, involve the Vietnamese civil society. Because now, you know very well, under the fatherland in Vietnam, the Communist Party controlled everything. So I believe there is something possible for Canada to work with some kind of private organization. Organization is not under umbrella of the Communist Party. That is very important. And with the role as Mr. When Marston play in the human rights, he can contact with SIDA to get accountable on any aid development from Canada to Vietnam. How those money to Vietnam and which organization in Vietnam is entitled to get, because otherwise those money will lead to the satellite organization of the Communist Party of Vietnam, and that is very important. So that's why I'm asking for Canada to create a joint Canada-Vietnam advisory. The board could have bridged the gap between the two countries, facilitating dialogue and exchange of ideas outside of the political area. It would be started by union leader, business leader, academician, and other members of society. Such an advisory board would provide advice to Ottawa and Hanoi on a wide range of issues, but more importantly, it would try to advance democratic and human rights reform in Vietnam. Second, I would argue that the government of Canada should move and extend opportunity for Vietnamese students and professionals to study in Canada through the scholarship and exchange program. Is it through education in which Canada can lay foundation for Vietnam's future leader? Of course, Such opportunity can and should be used to entice Vietnam-based scientists to settle in Canada and to contribute to the prosperity of Canada. But the more important thing, there will be always some of them who will return to the country, and it will be these Vietnamese who offer Vietnam best hope and a better future. However, I have to admit, like Mr. Dim Do said, the democratic process in Vietnam is very slow and it's a long way. There's a lot of hurdle to have. So any talk of reform in Vietnam must be discussed in the context of long-term goal. We have to be patient. I mean, today, Vietnam student and professional with the skill to shape the future of Vietnam politics would be an investment worth making. Is it not only a question of what the government of Canada can immediately achieve, but rather it can contribute to realize a desired outcome. Consequently, if the government of Canada intends to deepen relations with Vietnam, and it's the case now, it should dedicate resources specifically toward improving education in Vietnam by establishing a board of education in the country. Unlike the previously suggested Joint Advisory Board, this board of education would operate as an extension of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development Canada. Its effectivity will also be dependent on the resources provided and mandate given by the Government of Canada. If not afforded the necessary support over the long term, the board effectiveness will fail to achieve the desired objective. To this end, continued engagement with the Government of Vietnam is I would argue that should take the road to engage with Vietnam. However, Vietnam, the government of Vietnam must to help first. Can do the job for them. Canada can help, but Vietnam should help also. So in conclusion, I would say that the challenge facing Canada in the 21st century is diversifying its market and reaching out to developing countries. Diversification is not without its risk, as many emerging markets are located in developing countries, where the rule of law and required stability design may be absent, and where costs may always benefit, thereby deterring businesses from seeking out this new opportunity. Although Vietnam is a rising star in Asia, Canada would do well to look beyond and explore emerging opportunity. It is the role of our Parliament and government to determine the proper course for Canada. Whatever course charted, Canadian foreign policy must address democracy, rule of law, right, and balanced opportunity with Canadian value. These principles are for what Canadians are and for what we are known in the world. So this is my hope that this briefing tonight will be an opportunity for all of us to exchange different views and to share experience on how to improving the human rights situation in Vietnam and promoting the Canada-Vietnam relation. So thank you very much for inviting me for today, and I will be more than happy to answer any question that you may have.
Thank you very much, both Professor Wu and Dim Do. I'd ask Wayne, would you have a few comments?
Well, obviously, as this comes forward, there's thoughts that come to mind. When you talk about a mechanism between Canada and Vietnam, we have between Canada and China the Canada-China bilateral dialogue. That's been in place for a long time. There's problems with it. We did a study on China and the human rights a few years ago. And at this time, the functioning of that particular dialogue is at mid-level bureaucrats and not at the political level, but still something that functions. I mentioned earlier the trip that we took to Burma. When we went to Burma, because of the pressure of the international community wanting to access the resources of that country, the pressure had built to that government to respond with, at least in the beginnings, token evidence that they were moving to more democracy. We'll see how that carries out. But Canada sent a mission, which I was a part of, and we took staff from our House of Commons clerk's office, staff from the Senate office, the clerk's office, and political folks to talk to them over how our democracy functions. At some point, there may well be a place to try to offer the same thing if we see progressive moves happening. I agree that there's never more opportune time. I hate this term, but greed is an amazing thing. And when you've got natural resources, you've got the world looking at developing those resources, and a government that's sitting there that has an economy trouble, that's a lever. And that's an opportunity for the progressive countries to use to bring about change. Now, I'm going to have a conversation with Deepak O'Brien, who was the one that had the delegation for the government side when we went over to Burma, to just plant the seed that I don't mind if they call it their idea, but if we can plant the seed that might be a consideration. Because I think we have to, as Sir has said, have to demonstrate that Canada is prepared to do more than write letters. Letters are important. My office many letters in support of dissidents who were in prison, and we're thrilled to hear that some of them have been released, and there's more. This is a stage that we're at that we may never see in our lifetime if we don't take advantage of it. So I just wanted to make those comments.
So we'd open the floor to questions. Does anyone have, or anyone on the panel, or just general? Yes.
That's okay, I can speak.
We need translation though, if you. Yeah, you're on.
Yes.
Hello. It's fine. In terms of tensions, what about the possibility of working with Canadian media companies and getting the executives on board, because the Vietnamese government now, they're concerned, because I to affect changes, you kind of have to work with the current. So for the Vietnamese government now, their main issue is this so-called, South China Sea, whatever you want to call it, Common Asia Sea. Long time, whatever the network is. So perhaps what the government could get your own network on board, CTV, CBC, what may you, and on board to cover this story for the government, which they would love to do in exchange for loosening up some of the decrees that you've mentioned, and that way, you effectively, get them on board to some level, at least, to be able to talk about loosening up these terms. You can use your media, in that effect.
Yeah. I'd be glad to take a shot at that. The Canadian media is very Canada-centric in the way it views things. The media of much of North America has become more of an entertainment vehicle than actual news that we're accustomed to. Trying to engage them with it's a good idea, because any method that we can use to draw attention to the situation. So I'm not so sure how effective that we could be in getting them. And that's another conversation for the government. I am not a member of the government party. I'd have a little difficulty, but is trying to catch the ear of some of the people on the conservative side, and we'll try to do that.
I'd like to follow, if I may. To be honest with you, I myself personally haven't had much opportunity to work with the Canadian press, but I'm sure my local people have done so. But my experience has been more broad-based. I have dealt with the press, whether it's French or the Norwegian or the Australian or the American press. And I agree. Getting the media engaged is very powerful. And our policy has always been when we mobilize and lobby for support, we always for the NGOs as well. So in general term, getting the media to shine the light on the situation in Vietnam, whatever the issue might be, is a powerful tool. So in principle, however, we have to pick and choose which particular issue to focus on. Let's take the South China as an example. That particular issue is probably without lobbying, it's already has been a issue. It is probably, if you travel to Southeast Asia nowadays, as I recently did, the press in Southeast Asia talk about South China, talk about Vietnam, talk about China's aggression all the time. It's already in the news. However, it's the other issues that we need to put the focus on, such as the struggling economy in Vietnam. Not very many people realize that. Not very many people really talk about that. The human rights violation in Vietnam. Many countries in Southeast Asia tend not to pay attention to it because of their own dirty laundry, if you will. That's the reality. Mm-hmm. So I think, from my perspective, a million issues out there. There are tons of issues out there, and getting the media in general. Again, in principle, I totally agree with you. We get the media engaged, and we need to pick and choose the right issue.
I want a comment on my personal experience. I'm starting to write in 2009, and it took me my work. No media outlet interest on my work. But starting in 2011, when I focused on the question of the South China Sea and the prospect of Vietnam in within Asian, how Vietnam can play in Asian country, and then I got to know by some media in Southeast Asia, mostly in Hong Kong. So if you want, I can share my personal experience with you. I can share with you some talk in the Asia Time, Asia Sentinel, that I wrote a lot for them. And in Canada also, the magazine Embassy, they published also my some of my pieces over the last 2 years. But I just want to let you know, you knock on the door still closed. Knock again and again. One day it will open to you, and once the door is open, you are in, and you can give them whatever you want. But it's very hard. You must, if you want to interest the Canadian media, you must link something with Canada. What is important for Canadian? With some also Canadian in Canada don't the human right in Vietnam, but you can educate them by interest and interest them on the question of Vietnam, and then they will you a long way. So that's my experience.
Thank you. Other questions? We've got time, so feel free.
Yes.
I've got a couple quick questions, please. The first one would be for Mr. Diem Do, and the second one would be for Professor Vu. Well, I think ask Professor Vu this question first. You mentioned the idea of a joint committee between. Sounds like an excellent idea. Because I work in the office of NP Wayne Marston, and we deal with international human rights on a regular basis. Are you familiar with how well civil society network within Vietnam? Would it take to bring them into a position where they would be able to participate in that type of joint committee and how much would they be exposing themselves? And this, either of you can answer that, or anyone can answer that. That's because that would be a serious concern for me in participating. So I'll just leave that with you. Thank you.
Good question.
You to start first.
I was
Okay. It's up to you. I think you are better to address.
And then the professor will follow suit. In Vietnam, the civil society is a fairly new phenomenon. Organizations in Vietnam have existed for a long time, but during the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, all the way up to the 90s, organizations have traditionally been under the control of the Communist Party. Professor Vu mentioned the Fatherland Front. It's an umbrella organization that all organizations register with and have to be their control. Only recently, I would say for the last 10 years, with the influx of international NGO coming into Vietnam doing work, we began to see the development of organizations that are either semi-independent and some are actually fully independent from government's control. Why? Because they don't need the money from the Fatherland Fund to operate. They got money from the outside. The Fatherland Fund no longer the handout that has the power to hand out for these organizations to operate anymore. They receive directly from international NGOs, provide them with the springboard to break away from the control. Now, so over the last 10 years, we begin to see civil society sort of developing in Vietnam with either semi or fully independent organization. Now, the overwhelming majority of these organizations at this point are focused solely on charity, on social issues, deemed harmless to the government. So the government turned a blind eye to the fact that, okay, you no longer register with the Fatherland Fund, but you're not doing any harm, threatening the regime, we leave you alone. It's the grassroots organization that aim for legal reform, for human rights. That's the group that's causing the regime trouble. And they are still far and few in between. By my best estimate, at this point, the grassroots organization that fall into that threatening category to the regime, if you will, ranging only in about 30 to 40 groups. Not very many for a population of 88 million. Okay, so we have only a handful. Now, these handful organizations so far have fairly braved. They come out in the public, they operate publicly. Despite government harassment, they're weekly meeting, monthly meeting. The last time I checked, about 3 weeks ago, 22 groups met together. They building alliance, working together. Now, going back to your question, if we have some kind of a board and try to invite this group to participate, my experience in dealing with these people, they're not afraid. They'll take that risk. And sure, Tom, your worry is valid. I'm sure they will get harassed by the government. I'm sure they will get trouble from the government. But my experience in dealing with these people is that these people are fearful. They'll take that, will do it. The question though, that if this board actually come together and do some real good work and create some real pressure on the Vietnamese government, then the issue becomes, will they tolerate these groups? Mm-hmm. Will they crack down and send them all to jail? And that's the issue that we have to contemplate. That's the risk we have to contemplate. And again, the risk is there. For that you are willing to push the envelopes, nothing's going to happen. So again, going back to the idea of a board, I think it's a good idea. And we understand that these people who choose to participate, they choose to do so with full knowledge that they're taking risk.
Okay, so very much, Mr. Dindo. I just want to say a very brief word. First, I refer comment of Mr. Marston when he said about the Canada-China human rights dialogue. This is a very bureaucratic. Is the nothing work. So that is the idea that we come up. This is the work between me and a few colleagues in the University of Ottawa. We saying that how it work with Vietnam. Vietnam is not China, and Vietnam today is not Vietnam in the 19th. Vietnam today need to be integrated in the international community. Vietnam needs Canada, and Canada can have leverage on Vietnam. Vietnam is one of the 25 priority country for Canada. So we have a package. We come to Vietnam. We can ask Vietnam to do something. The idea of the Joint Advisory Board is not a government one. It is a private-public partnership. So we have to invite, for the Canadian side, we have to organize with Canadian civil society, with union leader, because Vietnam now is negotiated in the TPP entry. So Vietnam have to comply with the labor regulation also. So we must get engaged, labor leader. We must get engaged, university and all the organizations. We work together to the government of Canada. We come to the CEDA and say what we can do. Of course, we are there to overthrow the Hanoi regime, but we are there to have Hanoi on the right track to improving human rights in conditions in Vietnam and to go on the democratic way. So that for me is very important. The second point is how the Vietnamese people react to that. As I said, and Mr. Dindo already said, more than 65% of Vietnamese today is less than 55 years old. So they are very young and they well educated for the last 25 years of the policy of renovation of Vietnam. Vietnam is open to the world. So there's a lot of interaction between Vietnam and the rest of the world. People in Vietnam, they see and they witness the problem, the corruption in the country, the mismanagement of so they starting to raise some issue and to speak out, and that our role is just to have them have some audience like this audience today, invite them to come to explain to the Canadian opinion and to Canadian government what happened in Vietnam and how Canada and Vietnam can shape the future relation in the 20 years. Okay.
Wayne?
Just to add to it, there's nothing to prevent a two-tracked approach at the grassroots civil society level, which I totally agree with, and a consideration of the fact that TPP and the resource development on the other side, there's an opening there for a governmental to governmental operation, dialogue, whatever we want to call it, because people are now looking for the access to the country. The country is now for potential investment. And so by having that conversation, one of the things people fear in this world the most is change. And so you have a government that's been in power for a long time. And obviously there is change on the horizon, both economically and politically. If they're good enough to understand that, then it becomes an issue of managing the change in a way that's beneficial to the people. And so it should be a consideration, perhaps a two-track.
Certainly. Yeah, certainly.
Let's get another question to that.
Hello. Hello. I guess this is to follow up what DM Doe. This is to follow up what DM Doe mentioned earlier. You told us that there's 90 million citizens in Vietnam.
Yes.
40 million have access to the internet, which means they have access to any social media tools. Most importantly, you mentioned Facebook. 25 million people have Facebook accounts in Vietnam. That actually accounts for 28% of the population. So my question to you is it possible to use social media as a strong potential tool to unify the ideals of democracy between Canada and Vietnam?
Yes. And my short answer is yes. Yes, definitely. The social media, and I'm not trying to do a promo for Facebook here, but the reality is there are 25 million Facebook accounts in Vietnam, and Facebook is the most popular social media platform in Vietnam right now. Just want to point out, 5 years, 2000, the Vietnamese government got so worried about Facebook, they tried to shut down Facebook. And it actually was shut down for like 6 months. But the protest, the young Vietnamese was so intense, they actually had to bring back Facebook. Okay, so not that they are not aware of the potential of Facebook, they're aware of it, but we are in the 21st century, and they have no way to resist. Facebook, the internet is powerful, and actually it provides us with a space that people from the outside, Canadian, American, German, Swedish, Australian, to interact with the young Vietnamese inside of Vietnam. It is a powerful platform. It is being used right now as we speak by numerous groups to bridge the gap, to educate, to inform, to advocate, and to encourage people inside Vietnam to see the light, to speak their own rights, to defend their own rights. So again, I tried to make a short story long, but again, short answer is yes, totally agree with you.
Other back? Yes.
Either one.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I actually learned a lot coming from here. So I'm a recent graduate, and I understand that in order to take down a major organization, you have to target a single point of failure, which we've obviously established as the government. Chairman Doe, you mentioned to me that right now the government is facing internal conflict, weak mentality against China, problems with Facebook, and as well as a major economic breakdown. These in itself, each individual point could be reasons for this central point of failure to be broken. So what do you feel is the major tipping point to get to where we want to go? Because we know that we're not going the violent route. And my second question for Wayne is, what can Canada actually do from a foreign standpoint to help us get where we go, whether it be trade blocking, economic, or investment blocking?
Would you like to go first?
Sure. Not to be too specific, because I can't speak on behalf of the government, but my experience coming from a labor background, in union background of myself of years, and lots of negotiations in that time, you have what we call a carrot and the stick approach, and you have to be very judicial as to which one you use when. If we have a government that is punitive here in Canada, applies sanctions, is very harsh in their rhetoric, and pushes hard, there's no incentive there for Vietnam to do anything in response except to just say, we don't want to listen to you. The other hand, talk about improvements for that country as a result of investment, perhaps Canadian companies going in there, potential for agreements or whatever, to open the door to that conversation, while at the same time you have the grassroots conversation going on. My preference would be for that kind of engagement. And that's why I talked about the Canada-China dialogue. I don't want to mislead anybody. The Canada-China dialogue is not particularly successful. But when dealing with a regime such as China's, anything that's a connection is of some value. So I would suggest to you that there's something similar to that on the two tracks that I mentioned before.
I think the observation that we have, and is that the situation in Vietnam I shouldn't say that it's ripe for change. We're not quite there yet, but we certainly have developments producing a fertile ground for potential change. I like to repeat this, but I'm not quite convinced myself yet. But I recently spoke with a gentleman who does a lot of high-level work with the government official in Vietnam, and he traveled to Vietnam quite frequently. He just came back from a trip to Vietnam, and I sat down on top of him, exchanging information. I asked your up to time going to Vietnam and dealing with government official, and he told me that the situation in Vietnam is very volatile. When I met with government official off the record, they admitted to me that its situation is very volatile. It's like a cake of gunpowder sitting there waiting to be ignited. That's the exact words that he repeated to me that some official actually said to him. But the $64 million question is, how do you ignite that powder, that cake of gunpowder? How do you make it happen? Now, it could be anything. It could be the South China Sea dispute. It could be the corruption issue. It could be the collapse of the financial sector in Vietnam. It could be a multitude of everything. Okay, it could be a multiple of issues may ignite. Who knew? I used the example from who knew, because of a street vendor who self-immolated, and that brought down an entire regime. Okay, the catalyst could be anything, and the challenge for the democracy inside Vietnam right now is to find that catalyst to ignite change inside Vietnam. And the challenge and the desire we want to make sure that this change is nonviolent. We want to make sure that this change produces minimum damage to the Vietnamese society and to lives. We have no interest. We have absolutely no interest for violent change. And having made that choice also created constraints for us. In order for us, we have a non-violent change. We have to make sure that we have enough popular support. We have to make sure that our infrastructure inside Vietnam has the ability to mobilize a large number of people safely without being arrested by the government. So the choice that we have made is a challenge for us to identify where the catalyst might be, where's the tipping point might be. So to sum it up, the situation is leading us toward a fertile environment for change. The challenge for us to prepare the groundwork and identify the right moment, the right catalyst, we can ignite a peaceful, nonviolent change process. Sounds simple. It's not easy to do, but it is the choice that we have made, and we want to make sure that we choose the right place, the right time, the right area, and make sure that it is violent.
Questions? Anyone? Yes.
Hello. I'd like to ask a question from our viewers who are watching online. This question is directed to Diem Do. In the process of the democratization of Vietnam, how will Vietnam inspire people to put pressure on the Communist government?
How do we inspire people? Our message is very simple. It's about justice. It's about equality. It's about enough of this corruption, about protecting our national interests against aggression. We're in this fight to protect people's rights and people's interests. I once was asked by someone that, what, I mean, do you really, I mean, at the end of the day, what's the bottom line that you want for the Vietnamese people? And I actually thought about it, and my answer to this date is still the same. I want to make sure that the Vietnamese people in Vietnam have the right to choose freely. If they choose the Communist Party freely, that's all I want. What I want is to have a place and time and environment where the 90 million people in Vietnam choose freely. And if their will communism, then so be it. That's all we want. That's all I'm asking for. That's it. Simple as that. So that's the message I try to put out. That's the message we try to put out to the Vietnamese people inside Vietnam. We're fighting just for the right to choose, to protect your own interests. Whatever the people choose freely, so be it.
Very well said. Very well said. I think I saw a hand for a question. Anyone? Yes.
Maybe I just share something. I think it's very important. Mr. Do said about the population of Vietnam. Forget one thing. In Vietnam today, there are over 2/3 of Vietnamese under 35-year-old, and those persons, they aspire to a new standard of life. Yep. They need to be accepted in the world, and every time they have an opportunity to go outside of Vietnam, to see people, to talk with people in Canada, whether in Canada, in Europe, or in the United States, they witness the difference between what they live daily and Vietnam. And once they go back to Vietnam, they question themselves, what I have to do. Of course, I was raised in a very traditional Vietnam. I respect my parents. Even today, I'm almost 50 years old. Every time my father says something about important, I'm trying to go with him, not to go against him. The Vietnamese people also have this mentality. They don't go to fight in front. They are trying to get the angle more smoothly. And I believe one day the new generation of Vietnam will take care of themselves. They will say no to the government of Vietnam. And I believe the leader of the communist regime, they understand very well. Even in their own family, they have the problem because they are old and they cannot go with the young generation. So just beg you, Vietnamese overseas and Canadian friends, have the young people, try to have them, to get connected with the world and show them what is important for them. And I try to say, in the end of the day, it's up to you to decide your life. It's not to us to say what is bad for them. So I believe what we can do, we have them and social media and other means. We have them to discover the world, and they will make the choice by themselves.
Thanks very much. If I could just make two quick comments. One, in terms of a concrete action, Wayne, I'd ask for your feedback on this. A concrete step that is not costly and the infrastructure's in. I've heard it said earlier today, the role of the Canadian Embassy in Vietnam to do what other embassies have done in Vietnam, which is invite the families of those who've been detained to the embassy, to hold, I think the U.S. Embassy had actually held a session on how to organize, and one of the other embassies on how to or help civil society flourish. The Canadian Embassy could reach out and be somewhat of a platform. That's a tangible something the government could do. And before I have you answer that, I'd also just remind everyone, as we head into Amnesty International, and December 10th is the Human Rights Day. Letter writing campaigns. Never underestimate the power of those in this room, the letter, and the impact it has. I'm from Saskatchewan. I remember when the NDP were in power, one cabinet minister said, we weren't which way we're going. But the one side where they ended up siding with, they received 4 letters. And they went, so the impact of a letter, never underestimate. You think people don't read it, they do. And so I'd write to the Canadian Embassy directly, to the ambassador, and write to the Prime Minister and say, name a dissident, if there is one in particular, and ask the ambassador to intervene. Most people in positions like Ian do care and are concerned, so there's a lot of gravitas that would have. Also, the reason why the Vietnamese government, the communist government, had outlawed blogging and speaking about news is because when you write, as you earlier commented on social media, it works. There's a reason it's banned. So while people who are blogging inside Vietnam are having their human rights violated, certainly doesn't stop us individually from blogging, writing, and posting. Comment.
Sure.
Your studiums.
Well, first of all, the not so good news, but the really good news, and it's all the same thing. We're headed to a federal election, and I anticipate following the federal election, there'll be a governmental change. I obviously have a bias how I'd like that. Either way, I think that the current government of Canada will not be our then or for a different approach. I agree with you that the opportunities to utilize embassy staff. The unfortunate thing at this point, and you mentioned CETA before, CETA has been changed from being the kind of organization that was there to help people to an organization that's promoting Canadian businesses in other countries. So there's going to have to be changes made here in Canada to help situate this. One of the things very important here, the reality of this proposal is to create the capacity for people to do what they wish to do themselves. I think that's critically important. It's going to take a significant amount of strategizing as to where's the appropriate place for people from the outside to fit in. Vietnamese people, as you've said, have ownership of that. We can assist with the capacity. We've got to be careful that we don't become too far into that process. There's a balance that we've got to have. I repeat, we're going to be engrossed in the next federal election for a period of time. I guess some time for some thought on all of this as well.
Just to comment on the 2 suggestions that Chris had put on the table, naturally, international human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Freedom House, or AI Amnesty International, they have been powerful voices for support for human rights improve Vietnam. And I think we need to think of a way galvanize the Amnesty International and try to get them engaged on the writing campaign. In the past, I believe maybe 10 years ago, there was a time that AI put a lot of case of Father Whitman Lee, who is a Catholic priest who's still in prison right now. But it has been a long time since AI put the focus on Vietnam. So the situation is deteriorating in terms of more people getting arrested. I agree with you. It's time that we revisit trying to work with AI and see if we can get some kind of a writing campaign. And my experience in working with elected officials in many countries around the world, I echo your observation. Don't think that you're actually not being read. There's someone in the office reading letters. So, I mean, that's the feedback I actually received from staffers on Capitol Hill in the as well as other parliament words. And people read these letters, so we need to think about that.
Yep.
The embassy, I'm being very practical. In my experience dealing with numerous foreign ministries and State Department around the world, and I understand the role of the embassy of many countries, first and foremost, is to represent and protect the interests of that country in Vietnam. But having said that, we can also have to find a balance and work with a number of embassies, and in this case, the Canadian embassies, to somehow convince people there that helping human rights in Vietnam, promoting democratic value, actually in the long run is in the best interest of.
Yeah.
Imagine, think of a day when Vietnam is actually a free country, just like Canada, just like Australia, just like. Be easier to deal with a government like that, a country like that? Would you choose between dealing with the North Korean or the French? Would you know? The answer is right there. I mean, in the long run, it is really in the best interest of the two countries that we have a government that you can deal with easily, not someone who's so corrupt that it takes a lot of headaches dealing with them. I remember back in 2007, I had the work with the American National Security Council, and I remember Pat Davis, who was the director of the Asia division of the NSC. And I was, after my meeting, Pat did not move on to other responsibility. And after one session, I worked with Pat, and walking out down the hallway, and I asked Pat that really, can you share with me your observation on dealing with the Vietnamese government? And she said that, oh my God, it's a lot of headache. Choice. I'd rather deal with a democratic government than a dictatorship like this. These people are impossible to deal with. Mm-hmm. So I think the reality is, in the best interest of two nations, we want to see a healthy, strong, stable government in Vietnam. And with that kind of message, we can enlist more people on the embassy side to provide the assistance that we need.
I think we are winding down.
Yep. Yes.
I have one comment at the very end, if I could.
Yes.
I'm going to, so we have a last question,
Yes.
and then we'll,
Yes.
go ahead.
Hi, I'm just wondering, the question is directed to Jim Doe. You mentioned that there were some prisoners that were released, and I was wondering if you can elaborate on the conditions that they were released. Was the incentives because of international pressure, or was it, for lack of a better word, a selfish incentives from the government for the sake of looking good? And if the incentives were good, what can we do to that so more prisoners are released? Thank you.
Traditionally, there are two types of release. I'm talking about just the political dissidents, the democracy activists. The majority of the release still because they served out their sentences. They completed this. Few instances they got released 3 months earlier, 6 months earlier, but we don't count that. 6 months early release means nothing. Okay, but there have been instances of people who have been actually released way ahead of their schedule. But so far, the majority of these cases, these people were released way ahead of their schedule. They shipped right out into exile. Okay. Just a month ago, a well-known blogger, Bill Gay who was serving a 12-year sentence. I had to backtrack. His case is interesting. He first was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 3 years in prison. But at the end of his 3 years sentence, when he was about to release, they held him back and charged him violating Article 88, which was critics or propaganda against. He was sentenced to 12 years. And then 6 years into his 12-year sentence, he was released early and shipped straight to the U.S. just last month. So international pressures so far have proven to work in a number of cases, high-profile cases like Liu Kei, Nguyễn Văn Hải, or Gu Huihai. So international pressures so far have worked in high-profile cases. However, the trade-off here is that these people are shipped right out of the country, and as if it's a condition. We release them with the condition that they have to go into exile. I have to say that that's still better than having these people in jail. Don't get me wrong. I'm happy and I support these pressure. As I support getting these out from jail as early as we possibly can. But ideally, let's not make going into exile as a condition. And that would be the ideal situation. So I think, to sum up, international pressure has proven to work. But we need to make sure we fine-tune it a little bit and make sure that let's not just kick them out of the country and let the problem be solved. That's my main concern.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. This has been very informative. Wayne, thank you for hosting. And Professor Wu, thank you. And Dim Do, thank you very much. I've learned a lot. And obviously there's much work to do, but I think everyone's up to the task. Thank you, everyone. Sorry.
No, this is an example of it already working. Like this is on the route that we're already on. But the important thing, besides thanking everybody for coming, the crucially thing I have to say is I want to thank whoever brought that food because I enjoyed the cookies. Very much.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
This is a beginning.